Welcome back, Mindsetters. As you know, we are doing life sciences and we're doing environmental studies today, and we're focusing on the biosphere. So I hope that you guys have joined us. As I see on Facebook, you really, really have, and you're really involved, and I'm enjoying the interaction because shows me that you're actually enjoying it. So good. And if you want, you can call your other grade 10 friends and learners from school and tell them to join us because we are aware that this is a very important section in your grade 10 syllabus. So make sure that you keep focusing. Over to you again.
Thanks, Katleko. Yes, we cannot stress how important this section is, and you'll find that it's relevant, it's current, and we deal with issues like this in our everyday life. So we had a few questions posted on Facebook. We're going to deal. I'm going to answer. I'm trying to answer a few of those, and then we had a caller who called in and wanted to know the role of decomposers in the nutrient cycle. And yes, they actually beat me to that question. Let me get to back to the nutrient cycle. When we look at the consumers, these are the organisms that will utilize the food produced by the producers. Eventually, all consumers will die, and their nutrients would need to return back into the soil. And so we refer to that process of them being returned back into the soil as decomposition. So, what would play an important role in decomposition? Bacteria, exactly. So, the bacteria play a very important role in the process of decomposition. They will break down through different physiological chemical processes. They will break down the organic nutrients in these consumers. So it would be your plants will decompose, your consumers, your primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers would decompose with bacteria, and these nutrients then return back into the environment. Very important decomposer would be the earthworms in your garden, and they help to keep the nutrients. So they will feed on all the dried leaves, and they will return the nutrients back into the soil. In the wild, you've got animals that die, and they are eaten by the other larger scavengers, and the carcasses that are left over will decompose by bacteria, and those nutrients then return back into the soil. Okay. If we go on, so the nutrient cycle is needed for living organisms to do the following, so that energy can flow through the ecosystem. Nutrients move from the environment to the living organisms and back again into the environment. So this is why we refer to this as a cycle. This means that there's a fixed amount of nutrients in the biosphere, which is cycled over and over again. And hence, we say that the bacteria and the decomposers play a very important role in returning the nutrients back into the soil to be available to producers all over again. Okay. The next cycle we're looking at is the carbon cycle. Okay. When we look at carbon, carbon is a very important element. At the start of grade 10, your teachers would have discussed with you organic compounds. When we look at carbon, carbon plays an important role, is an important element in organic compounds. An example of an organic compound is glucose, C6H12O6. There you find carbon, which is an important element in that compound. Okay, so carbon, which is very important to plants and animals, is found in your carbohydrates, your fats, and your proteins. So it's essentially a building block, a building element in your important organic compounds. Photosynthesis and respiration are the two main processes that drive the carbon cycle. So these processes are responsible for driving the carbon cycle, producing carbon and utilizing carbon so that the levels of carbon in the atmosphere remain stable. Okay. When we look at the cycle, the carbon cycle, we see two main processes here: respiration and photosynthesis. And yes, respiration and photosynthesis happens both on the land as well as in the water body. So it's both on the lithosphere as well as in the hydrosphere. Let's look at photosynthesis in the water bodies. So photosynthesis will take place by plants that are capable of trapping radiant energy from the sun and producing glucose. For photosynthesis to take place, plants require carbon dioxide, and these would utilize carbon dioxide and produce oxygen. Respiration would produce carbon dioxide. As a result of respiration taking place in the mitochondria, utilizes oxygen and produces carbon dioxide, which then returns back into the atmosphere. The same applies for these two processes on land: respiration by animals and photosynthesis by plants. Plants produce oxygen, they utilize the carbon dioxide present in the air and produce oxygen. Respiration by your cattle and your animals on land produce large amounts of carbon dioxide, which then contribute to the pool of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Okay. So carbon dioxide is available in the air and in water. During photosynthesis, plants utilize carbon dioxide to make carbohydrates, which is the simple sugars. Okay. The carbohydrates are then passed along the food webs from the producers to the consumers. We saw that in the previous slide during the nutrient cycle. Okay. It is then returned back into the environment through the following ways. During respiration, where carbon dioxide is released back into the environment, by decomposition through bacteria and other decomposers that produce carbon dioxide. These organisms feed on dead plant and animals, and they give off carbon dioxide, which then gets back into the atmosphere to maintain the amount of carbon dioxide in the environment. Humans are also important major contributors of carbon in the environment. Apart from respiration, we also burn fossil fuels, we cut down trees, and we burn forests. And these release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And what is unique about human intervention is that it is much more than in the past. So humans have contributed to large amounts of carbon production in the atmosphere, and this is unsettled, this is left to an unstable carbon cycle. We're going to do that at the end of the slide. The delicate balance is maintained between the removal of carbon dioxide from the air and water by photosynthesis and its return and the return of carbon dioxide to the environment by respiration. The amount of carbon dioxide in the air should remain same. However, this is not the case. We will discuss the influence that humans have had on the carbon cycle. But the level of carbon dioxide is increasing because of human activity. We will discuss that impact soon. The consequences of this is the greenhouse effect as well as global warming, which has obviously led to escalated temperatures on the earth, destruction of the ozone layer, and drought. Okay. The next cycle we're going to look at is the nitrogen cycle. Living things need nitrogen to make proteins. Nitrogen is a gas that makes up 78% of the atmosphere. Nitrogen is not utilized by the organisms or by humans. They need to be first changed to nitrates before they are used. And for this process, plants play a very important role. So it's the plants that convert atmospheric nitrogen into nitrates, which are then utilized by other living organisms. Let's look at the cycle in detail. So the atmosphere contains 77% nitrogen. This is then fixed by bacteria in the roots of leguminous plants. So we've got certain plants that have nitrogen, which have nodules, and in them we've got bacteria. And these bacteria are responsible for trapping atmospheric nitrogen and converting them into nitrates. These plants are then utilized by organisms, and they convert the nitrates into proteins. So they play a very important role as a source of protein, as an element for protein development, which animals rely on. These proteins then will return back. Once the animal decomposes, these proteins will be broken up, and during the process of decomposition, bacteria then break down the proteins and return the nitrates back into the soil. During excretion, large amounts of waste are produced. We have denitrifying bacteria that will convert some of the nitrates back into nitrogen, and that is how the nitrogen pool is maintained in the atmosphere. In the ocean bodies, we've got nitrogen fixing blue-green algae, which also fix the nitrogen in the atmosphere, and this is then available to the aquatic organisms. Again, when they decompose, these nitrates are then returned back into the soil. The denitrifying bacteria will then break them down and convert them back into nitrogen. Okay. So animals get their nitrogen from plants that they eat. Bacteria break down the dead plants and animals, converting the proteins into ammonium ions. Ammonium is changed into nitrates by certain bacteria. This process is called nitrification. Okay, I'll repeat this again. Ammonium is changed into nitrates by denitrifying bacteria. This process is called nitrification. Okay. We then have nitrogen fixing bacteria, which are able to take the nitrogen gas from the air and convert them into bacterial proteins, and this is how the nitrogen cycle will maintain the level of nitrogen in the atmosphere. The next cycle we look at is the oxygen cycle. Okay. The oxygen cycle is the movement of oxygen among the atmosphere, biosphere, and the lithosphere. The main reservoir of the Earth's oxygen is the Earth's crust, and it contains 99.5% of the Earth's oxygen available. Here's the cycle of the oxygen cycle, here's the diagram of the oxygen cycle, which we look at in detail. So the two main processes that are responsible for maintaining the amount of oxygen in the environment is photosynthesis and photolysis. Let's look at these two processes in detail. So in the biosphere, the driving factor of the oxygen cycle is photosynthesis. During photosynthesis, plants use carbon dioxide and water, and they produce sugars, which is glucose and oxygen. In addition to photosynthesis, photolysis also contributes to the amount of oxygen in the environment, in the atmosphere. So what is photolysis? During this process, high energy UV radiation breaks down the atmospheric water and nitrates into hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. And that is how the oxygen levels are maintained in the oxygen cycle. So if we look at this cycle again, so we see photosynthesis, the plants being the major contributors of the oxygen levels in the atmosphere, along with photolysis, which is the effect of sunlight on the atmosphere, and that contributes to the amount of oxygen. Respiration and decay also, there's certain anaerobic bacteria that produce oxygen during the process of decomposition. Okay, go on to the next slide. Okay, before we go on to the next slide, we're going to take some questions. Okay, I've put up a few questions, but Katleko during the break obviously chatted to me, and there were some questions that were raised by you guys. Katleko, could we have those questions?
Yes,
now?
you can. One question is by Nsako. He asks, what is the difference between biosphere and biodiversity?
Interesting question, Nsako. Okay, I'm going to elaborate on those two concepts just below this here. Okay, so biosphere and biodiversity. Okay, so we've dealt with biosphere today. Biosphere refers to the three components that make up the environment. So it's the air, water, and the soil and rocks. Biodiversity, on the other hand, refers to the variety. If we break down the word biodiversity, it refers to the variety. So diversity refers to the variety, and bio refers to living organisms. So if I were to answer this question correctly, biodiversity refers to the variety of living organisms inhabiting an area, and we know that South Africa is a country with rich biodiversity because we've got a variety of living organisms in it. Biosphere refers to the three components which we've discussed already. So that's the air, the water, the rocks in the soil, and the interaction with the living components. Okay, hope that answers your question, Sako.
Okay, next question. This one just came in by Priska. No, sorry, that's not the Priska one. Kelly. Kelly asks, what is a decomposer?
Interesting question. Decomposers are organisms that will be responsible for breaking down the dead organisms, the dried leaves, and returning them back into the environment. So decomposers could be microscopic organisms, or even some of your smaller invertebrates which utilize or which feed on organic matter or dried dead leaves, etc. So they are responsible for breaking down and returning nutrients back into the soil.
Okay. So let's just ask Priska's one before we go to a break. She asks, what happens to the biosphere due to global warming? And despite temperatures, how does this damage the well-being of the human?
Interesting question. When we get back after the break, we're going to deal with this in detail. But yes, and that is the concept of understanding the environment today. Once we understand the environment and the cycles, we will then be able to understand the impact that humans have had on this. Essentially, through increased carbon emissions, we've offset the balance of carbon dioxide in the environment. Global warming, greenhouse effect are all consequences of an increased human activity in the environment. The simple example that I can give you is if we cut down all the trees, there's not going to be enough of oxygen produced by the trees for human activity. The amount of carbon dioxide would increase because obviously trees are not going to be able to utilize the carbon, and hence we will have a shift in the balance between the carbon dioxide levels and the oxygen levels.
Okay, so can we take a quick break? Remember that during the break, you can ask questions. So you can keep sending in your questions. And the ones that we have now, I am going to show you again so that he can answer it in our last segment. See you after the break.